Okay, hello from UCLA. Welcome to this book presentation in coordination with the other with the 4 UC Migration Research Centers. The Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative at UC Berkeley, the Global Migration Center at UC Davis, and the Center for the Study of International Migration at UCLA. And this time we also have we're doing this in coordination with the Latin American Institute at UCLA. So thank you everybody for joining us. Today we have the presentation of a new book by Andrew Selee, who is president of the Migration Policy Institute, co-authored with Diego Chaves-González, senior manager at Migration Policy Institute's Latin American Caribbean Initiative, Valerie Lacarte, senior policy analyst at MPI in the US Migration Policy Program, and Ariel Ruiz Soto, senior policy analyst at MPI, where he works on US immigration policy. We have, the authors are going to take about 25, maybe 30 minutes for their presentation, and then we will have, as a discussant, Rubén Hernández-León, who is professor of sociology at UCLA and also director of the Latin American Institute. So we will, they will present, Rubén will give about 15 minutes comments, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So we can start.
While Ariel is starting the PowerPoint, hello, Christine Hundefeld, my former master's thesis chair, actually, and advisor. So
nice to
good
see
to see you on here.
Thank you.
Hi, Christine. Good to see you.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. Can someone confirm to me that you can see my slides and then we can listen? Okay, great. So it's a great pleasure to be with you all. I am specifically excited to speak with you, one, because this is an exciting book and a particularly timely moment to talk about migration in Latin America and the Caribbean, but also because based in Sacramento, I've gotten to know a lot about your centers, and I'm very always curious and interested in keeping those communications with you. So happy for you all to be here and happy to connect in California at an appropriate time. So our book, what I'll do is we're going to start with in our book, we have different chapters. Each of the chapters were worked by different authors, but we really worked together in a process that I think culminated in the findings of what makes Latin America and the Caribbean so rich as an important focus on immigration. We'll talk about why that is the case, that we wanted to focus on it. We'll talk about what it is that we actually looked at, how we did it, and then we'll talk about some of the general findings and the key stories that we document in the book to then get your take and in the discussion, answer your questions. Obviously, the book that we've written was done toward the end of last year. Things have changed, and I expect and we could have some conversation time at the end to talk about how things have changed since the publication of the book, but also since the coming of the second Trump administration. The first reason, or the first thing to talk about is we really, through this book, wanted to refocus the conversation about migration from Latin America and the Caribbean, to focus on specific things that the countries that make up this region, but also the governments within this region, were trying to lead into impact in trying to adapt to changing times, especially with years in the making migration patterns. We wanted to center Latin America and the Caribbean specifically because we oftentimes, when we hear about migration, we see it either from the US perspective, or we see it in some cases from the European perspective, and others we don't oftentimes get to see and talk about what Latin American governments and Latin American and Caribbean governments are doing and how they engage with policy decisions. This question, it started really with a question about whether Latin America and the Caribbean have a migration management model. And we'll explore through the slides, but also in our conversation with you, whether there is whether we can call a model into place in the region and what it looks like. We also wanted to document the history of migration, to think about forward-looking policies, especially at a very critical time then, and continues to be today, in how these countries are each engaging with their decision making, but also how they are affecting each other as they go through this decision making. And we wanted to shed the light, especially because of the diversity of Latin American and Caribbean countries, how differently perhaps, but also similar they can be in how they're presenting and preparing or reacting to migration patterns, specifically as it's changed across the region. And specifically here, I think you'll see once we get to the sections that each region has differences, but there's also a lot that ties them together in how they look and how they work together or not. Finally, we wanted to establish a turning point about hemispheric collaboration in the region, specifically after some of the Americas, where really a lot of the countries were coming together, not all the countries, but many of them were coming together to better understand and to work together with each other. We wanted to try to figure out what would happen, how we got to that point, and then what could potentially happen now under very different socio-political perspectives across our landscape. So the focus on Latin American or migration in Latin America stems from looking at understanding how many immigrants and migrants there are in the region, as opposed to usually focusing into how many of those migrants are in the United States. And what we see here, I hope you can see from the screen, shows you that there's about, when you put together the total number of population of immigrants in the region, we have about 30 million immigrants in the region. You can see here in the table, it shows you them broken up by different regions. North America is the largest share, but is not the only share of immigrants in the region where they come from. And I think it's a particularly important piece here, understanding that this is not something that just started or something that's changed. It's something that has been building for a long time, and where people are going to is specifically important for Latin American and Caribbean immigrants across the world. Of course, there is also an arrival of immigrants that came to the United States in a or colonial and post-colonial period, primarily through slavery, enslaved Africans. We wanted to acknowledge that much of that happened, specifically about 6.2 million enslaved Africans came to the Americas in this particular case, but also Europeans, including the Middle East. And then most recently, after what has happened as well, has been an important movement of migrants or immigrants in the region, specifically from Europe and the Middle East, that happened after the colonial period. And I think this specifically sets us up for infrastructure and understanding how these systems maybe are reacting to new flows, but how many and how they've come together in previous ways in the past, not just in recent times. Obviously, we have to speak about what's happened and migration toward the United States that really has become a catalyst for migration patterns that changed recently. And that tends to be a story that's changed since the 1970s, but even before then, about how immigrants or migrants arrive at the US-Mexico border and then into the United States. Most of that migration in the 1970s had been from Mexican immigrants. There was, of course, always been people from other places, but primarily from Mexican immigrants, and that began to increase in the 80s. You got to see smaller an increase in the early 2000s. And then, of course, we started after the pandemic in a significantly new stage of migration in the hemisphere, but specifically of Latin American immigrants toward the United States. And you can see clearly in that graph that after 2020, we've seen a spike in migration to the United States, specifically as a measure of encounters. And we can specifically look at different nationalities. When you look at also the Darien Gap, I think it gives you a different setting into how to look at how the changes are happening. First, we've seen the Darien Gap, by the way, is the jungle that exists between Panama and Colombia that became significantly more visible and present as it hadn't been in the past, because more and more people were crossing from Colombia into Panama from different nationalities. And in fact, by 2024, from many different places, from India, from Europe, and from other places in Africa as well, that were coming into South America, traveling from South America into the Central America, and then moving forward toward the United States. But not all of them were going toward the United States. The graph here that I show you, I hope you can tell differences. I know the grading is a little bit difficult to read, but I hope you can see that primarily we saw some episodes of migration in the region from Cubans in the 2015, 2016 times. We saw some Haitians also using the Darien Gap to try to come to Central America, Mexico, and some to the United States. But after 2021, we saw a significant change in the nationalities of those people that were trying to move in the region many of them coming from Haiti at the beginning, but predominantly Venezuelans are after. And in fact, the graph doesn't show here a bar for 2025, but if you were to look at 2025, compared to about the 300,000 people that we've seen across the Darien for around 3,000 or so people that have crossed the Darien this year so far. That's changed the dynamics, of course. It's changed the nationalities, but it's been an important aspect in how people are moving or thought about moving to the region and the hemisphere. Our methodology for the book really tried to hone in not just on the data that I've gone over and the policy that we've known. We tried to interview stakeholders across the regions to try to understand what differences their work was doing, but also the differences that were adapting to these countries. We tried to take a different perspective as well by including life stories, culture. We tried to focus in every chapter, include an aspect of a tangible human person trying to understand how migration has affected them and how they are affecting migration overall. There's several examples across the book that we talk about, and we try to talk about that richness that does happen for migration, not just this aspect that happens between them. We also it was hard to avoid, but it's specifically important in this moment now to keep in context what U.S. policy has done to try to change migration patterns in recent times. And we wanted to make sure that was also the focus, even if it wasn't the forward focus or the center of it. We wanted to understand how these countries are evolving around and in response to US policy changes. An example of what we've done before very clearly shows you here in this table. We looked at immigrant population across the different Latin American and Caribbean countries, and we looked at understanding how that's changed. You can clearly see here from the 1990s, there was about 7 million immigrants in the region. Now that jumped to 18 million, excuse me, in 2023. And you can see how those changes were actually different across the time. And some of them that, like Argentina, for example, have remained relatively stable, but others, we've seen increases, important increases over time, for example, in Colombia, especially because of Venezuelans, and we'll get into this in a moment, but also in other places where people are beginning to consider not just places of emigration, but also places of destination and immigration. We also looked at detailed analysis of where people were coming from, not just where they were going. We saw, for example, in this slide shows you about the CARICOM member states in the Caribbean and where the top nationalities of migrants are coming from. In Antigua and Barbuda, for example, it was Guyana, Dominica, and Jamaica. But there was also other states other countries, excuse me, that we were trying to understand, not just the numbers, but the differences and how this is actually a much more intra-regional migration that we've seen develop across time, and those how they could be changing. Obviously, for some of the countries and for some of the governments, the migration has been, even if in smaller numbers, a greater share of their population, and therefore entail different responses from the public. I mentioned about life stories and culture. We try to bring in references to how this interdynamics of migration actually enrich the culture and the living conditions across this region. And we have a focus on storytelling. An important example at the beginning of the book is Alexander Beja, who is a Venezuelan immigrant in Colombia. It's a really, really important story about him trying to be a musician, having very much a luck to try to go to Mexico was after he was able to be discovered there with some with a promoter there, but then trying to understand what that would mean because of the different limitations on mobility that the region has, even from Colombia to Mexico as a Venezuela. So let's get then into the sections that we have here. The first one is South America, and it's really a story about Venezuelan migration in the recent past, but it's a story that's evolving. And I think we have to underscore how South America has been oftentimes not the first focus of attention when we think of migration in the US perspective, but clearly an important aspect of it that's happened. We know that immigrants from Venezuela have had a significant, especially in the last 7 or so years, since at least 2015 but forward, we've seen a significant change in how immigrants from Venezuela are actually changing, but also contributing to the dynamics in South America. And the key, at least for Venezuelans, the key destinations have been Colombia, but also Peru, Ecuador as well in some cases. And each of these countries have been adapted differently to them. We'll get into a moment into how that's looked like. There's also, even in smaller numbers, many Venezuelans that are settling in Brazil and Chile, each of them with different responses by the public and by the government to try to provide services. But it's clear to when we, at least back in 2024, when it was mostly focused, there was a significant focus in the US about Venezuelan immigrants. Oftentimes, what didn't get into that picture was that the majority of Venezuelan immigrants were actually staying in South America. And I think that's a component that we're now beginning to see change, but an important nonetheless to go and to include more specifically. As Venezuelan immigrants, the largest population of immigrants in South America in the recent past increased, more governments began to try to figure out how to assist, and in a very important, I would argue, creative way, understand ways to respond to Venezuelan displacement by providing people with temporary, even if temporary, legal measures or legal statuses or programs for them to be able to receive certain services across the board. Again, a very creative, imperfect, but a very creative response across South America for thousands and thousands of Venezuelan immigrants that were seeking access and integration into their communities. It's really became a story about policies of integration that were intended to go beyond emergency responses. And in Colombia in particular, the largest destination of Venezuelan immigrants for many reasons, among those the cultural and historical ties that they share, it became focused specifically on trying to find these temporary statuses, regularization programs that were about 1.6 million at one point, 10-year permits for people to live in that country, Venezuelans to live in Colombia and be able to work and have access to services. So Colombia definitely has been perhaps the focus, or at least the key to South American mobility in the recent past, but significant numbers also occurred. In Chile, we saw also changes, obviously, with the public perceptions, like we have seen in other parts of the region that have been important, and specifically in reactions to what people perceive those instances are as more people stay or not in the region and move forward, especially with initially Venezuelans going to Colombia, but then from Colombia deciding to continue northbound toward the US or to Central America, Mexico, and then potentially to the United States. This has presented, this mobility of Venezuelan migration has presented multiple challenges, but also opportunities in South America, we would argue. And specific opportunities have been regional mobility agreements. I'm always impressed by how many agreements South America has for mobility across the region. Mercosur, the Andean Community, and the UNASUR, although the UNASUR is no longer functional, these other agreements actually are bound and seek to improve mobility across the region in ways that we haven't seen in the past. There's been long historical migration ties. Even before the Venezuelan migration, we've seen Peruvians and Bolivians go to Chile, Bolivians and Paraguayans go to Brazil. And all of these aspects have, I think, led in part to some of the welcoming responses, or the warm responses at least, by, for example, Chile and Brazil, as other countries as well. We've seen an increase at the same time. We've seen some challenges. We've seen an increase in diversification of migrant outflows to the United States from places where migrants were seeking to integrate. Colombians specifically have risen or rose in 2023 and 2024 in significant numbers, trying to leave Colombia for many different, some for insecurity, others for economic, and others for other reasons, but to leave the country and to try to emigrate northbound, increasingly to the United States in 2024. Ecuadorians the same. We've seen an increase in Ecuadorian migration and Peruvian migration, especially around related issues to security, though not only about security. And for Ecuadorians, the key component that really has got my attention is the challenges that migration brings to these type of flows, because many of them, or at least a large share of them in 2023 and 24, were families. Colombians, Venezuelans, at least at the beginning, were usually single adults traveling. Ecuadorians tended to travel mostly in families. And of course, with the challenges kind of alluded to, and we can come back to at the end, it's been important. The political landscape has changed. We've seen more governments in response to these larger flows adopt, in some cases, anti-immigrant policies, or at least anti-immigrant rhetoric that has, in some cases, been counterproductive to prior attempts to integrate migrants. But we should also think about migrants themselves as being agents in that change. They've pushed back, and especially in places in South America and in Colombia, that have actually been included in more places, that there's local initiatives that have been really important in providing those access to these places. Mexico and Central America have always, maybe not always, but have for a long time been tied to US drivers' pressures and policies. So migration from Mexico and Central America maybe less so than in other regions, has been more toward the United States. I mentioned earlier with the graph that migration in the 90s and early 2000s was predominantly Mexican, but there's also been a decrease since then, relatively speaking, between the 2010s and 2019, of migrants from Mexico decreasingly coming, or less of them coming irregularly at the US-Mexico border, seeking to enter that way. At the same time, we have seen an increase in legal migration from Mexico to the United States to programs like the H-2A and H-2B programs for temporary and mostly agricultural work. It's important to note, however, that after the pandemic, there's been a small uptick, and that uptick continues, even despite the smaller numbers today, of Mexicans now emigrating to the United States. An important changes happened in the 2023-24 era was that more families and unaccompanied Mexican children were coming to the United States. And in some cases for economic reasons, but also for changes in security conditions across Mexico that have been important. At the same time as Mexican migration had seen a relative decrease, we saw an increase in crossings and migrations from Northern Central Americans, and that included mostly Guatemalans and Hondurans. There has been some Salvador migration, but it's relatively decreased in recent times. This figure here shows you the differences, and Salvador has been the lower of the three, especially since around the pandemic. It continues, but it's an important aspect of it. We should say that Central American migration to the United States actually has its roots in different processes in the past, and especially during the civil wars that happened in the region. So what we've seen is also, like Mexicans, these migrants from Northern Central America actually had significant uptakes and established opportunities in the region, the longer time they have here. Mexico has also become recently a sending country as well as a receiving country. This figure shows you that Mexican migration authorities have actually increasingly, at least since 2019, increased their controls and are detaining and encountering more immigrants from many more places. I know you can't really tell the gradients in the graphs, but it's specifically at the top from 2023 and 2024, you can see that the share of those recent flows has become increasingly non-Central American as opposed to in the past. Most of these migrants that were coming before were from Central America, and increasingly they were from other places like Venezuela primarily, but also from other places in Asia and Europe that are important to consider. Asylum applications in Mexico have increased. There's been an internal mobility that's been very clear. And in fact, in 2023, Mexico was the third country in terms of the largest number of requests that are received in the world, only behind the United States and Germany. Since then, we've seen a decrease in 2024 and 2025. If we had the numbers, we will be a little bit lower, but clearly more people, either by choice or by necessity, have sought to seek assistance and refuge in Mexico going forward, potentially also going forward. The opportunities and challenges in Mexico's Central American region is that there had been episodes of unaccompanied children from Central America migrating, and they require specific access to services that are more challenging to provide. I didn't mention Costa Rica, but Costa Rica is an important aspect too, that has been increasingly a going destination from Nicaraguan migrants and increasingly to other nationalities when they were coming through the Darien. The Darien and Panama, the Panama politics about the Darien have changed significantly. Recently, Panama has implemented more controls, but certainly also has benefited from the migration economically, speaking through those places. And now we're beginning to see a challenge in the future, potentially, if there are deportations from the United States in large numbers, that many of these countries in Central America and Mexico specifically would have to then face new questions about how to understand what or how they receive migrants that are being returned. For the next piece, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew to talk about the Caribbean and talk about this difference in the other region. So Andrew, I'll pass it over to you and I'll click your slides.
Great. Let me recognize Caitlin Yates, who's also on this call, since we're talking about the Darien, who is, has done her PhD research and now writing a book on the Darien Gap and transit through there. So anyone who has questions on that, Caitlin also, we very pleased that we knew her when she worked at MPI also with us. So we're pleased to always follow her work, and actually cited a lot in the book too. So, okay, so Caribbean is a very different reality. And what you should see is these are three different realities: Mexico and Central America, and there are variations within them too. South America, Central America and Mexico are always tied to the United States in different ways, although increasing numbers of people staying in Costa Rica and Mexico. As Ariel said, South America has largely been, where there's been the huge surge of Venezuelan population, though that's affected every country in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as movements of other populations, Haitians and Colombians and others. And then we get to the Caribbean, and the Caribbean, it has a really diverse migrant population. The first thing you'll see, and this actually, not surprised by the first nationality, Haitians are about a third of migrants living in Caribbean countries. Then you get into other countries, the ones that are not named here. And then you get into the second largest single country that is a source for migrants in the Caribbean is the United States. And to be honest with you, we have not been able to figure this one out entirely. We think it's a mixture of, this is also true in Mexico. The US is the #1 nationality for migrants, but that tends to be a mixture of smaller number of people in Mexico for work, or working in multinationals or remote workers, but a much larger number of children of Mexican migrants who've returned to Mexico or been returned to Mexico. In the Caribbean, we're not quite sure, to be honest. We think it's everything from Americans who've moved by choice to the Caribbean to also children of migrants who are nationals of the countries who have come back. And then, of course, it's very diverse with people from some of the colonial powers. You see France and the UK on there, the Netherlands, but also Venezuelans are significant, particularly in Trinidad, Aruba, Curacao, and Dominican Republic. And then there's actually a lot of Dominican migration. Dominican Republic is both a destination for Haitians, but it's also a country from which migrants come to other countries as well as to mainland US. Next slide. Immigration is a decades-long phenomenon. There has been an attempt to try and create mobility among high-skilled workers, which we'll see in a minute, but there's also mobility among all sorts of other workers and nationals. Go to the next one. We can go to the next one, Nadia. One of the things that is really important in the Caribbean, and this is a theme throughout the book actually, is how much there are how much there are mobility agreements among countries in the hemisphere. In South America and Central America, that's somewhat weaker, but in South America, it's both the Andean community and Mercosur. In the Caribbean, you have both the CARICOM and OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. The OECS, which are 7 member states, all fairly small island republics, and all similar levels of development, have a very deep integration. In fact, any member of any state can move to another one and work, can remain there, can work, can go to school. It is the Schengen zone of the Western Hemisphere. It is, essentially a free mobility region. It's been particularly important. There's an anecdote in there that in the book that we start one of the sections with, of the hurricane in Dominica a few years ago, where much of the population of the island of Dominica, not Dominican Republic, but the country of Dominica, actually moves to other countries. They're simply able to use the free mobility arrangement to move to other countries. And then most of them move back in the end, actually, once the reconstruction takes place. But some of this happens very seamlessly. CARICOM is much more restricted. There is free mobility in terms of using identity documents rather than passports, but only professionals in certain categories have been allowed to move to other countries and remain under the mobility agreement. However, CARICOM countries just signed, literally a few weeks ago, long after we had finished the book. They were negotiating it. We talk about that in the book, but they actually now have signed the agreement to update the mobility arrangement. Haiti is excluded. Most of the other countries are in there. It is 4 countries, last I checked a couple of weeks ago, had already approved in their national legislation the necessary laws to put this into place. And it expands the number of people and different professions beyond university educated professions to other trades and skills for which people can then move to other countries and remain. There's a great deal, there's other corridors, of course. Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico is a huge one, as well as Haiti to the Dominican Republic. Cuba is quite involved in cooperation. Cuba is the country with the least immigration within the Caribbean, but it is quite involved. But it is a country that sends people elsewhere in the region. Is quite involved on cooperation with other countries, and there's lots of migrant labor to non-sovereign states as well, Curaçao, Aruba, and others. Humanitarian displacement, especially of Haitians, has largely been left unaddressed. It's a third of the people who have moved. Many of them are in irregular status, especially in the Dominican Republic, where you have seen, statelessness because of a Supreme Court decision, which deprived many Haitians and their children and grandchildren of nationality, even though they had acquired Dominican citizenship or been born in the Dominican Republic. We see back and forth relations with Haitian populations in other countries as well, often tolerated, even in irregular status, but then sometimes rejected as well. Bahamas, Turks and Caicos are also particularly important destinations for Haitians. Lots of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as in the Dominican Republic. It is the only country that does not actually allow Venezuelans to have, or immigrants in general, if they're in a regular status, to have access to the education system, except for very limited exceptions. There are small numbers of asylum seekers from Africa, Cuba, and other places, but most countries in the Caribbean do not have asylum systems. They either delegate it to UNHCR or they sort of look the other way on it. So there are a few countries that have asylum systems, but many simply don't even have them in place. Next slide. So concluding thoughts, what do we take away from all of this? The Darien Gap is really when the three migration systems, South America, Central America, and Mexico, and the Caribbean came together. We saw a number of regional cooperation frameworks emerge. Some of these had been emerging for a long time, like Mercosur and CARICOM. These actually have roots back in going back a couple decades. Others have emerged more recently. The Andean community, for example, which has existed for a long time, only recently in 2021 implemented its mobility framework. The CARICOM continues to evolve its mobility framework, as we just talked about. You saw the Declaration of Los Angeles, which involved Canada and the US, as well as Latin American Caribbean countries, which short-lived, but important while it lasted. As well as a response network, actually two response networks around the Venezuelan displacement that have been very important. So there's a lot of cooperation frameworks, some more active than others, but all quite interesting, actually, and all have some importance that have developed in Latin America and the Caribbean over the past few years. There are lots of creative ad hoc regularization policies. We talk about this a lot in the book, but there's a range of responses to displacement crises. In a few cases, countries like Brazil and Mexico have used their asylum systems, but mostly they've used, even maybe Mexico and Brazil have used their regular visa systems or mobility agreements, or they've created ad hoc regularizations. Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and other countries have done lots of ad hoc regularization. Generally, there has been a bet on legal status, imperfect, often poorly institutionalized, often temporary, but generally speaking, this is a region where when displacement crises have taken place, there's been some ability to respond with measures that allow people to stay legally, to work, and to enter the education system. Less true of Haitians in the Caribbean, more true of Haitians in South America and Venezuelans and Nicaraguans. We think there's 6 factors that have influenced a fairly open migration policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Open in the sense of it has become less politicized so far, except in the Dominican Republic. But perhaps in Chile, we'll see the election this weekend. But generally less politicized than other parts of the world, and generally more pragmatic and more accepting of immigrants and refugees with less political pushback. Yes, lots of grumbling, but less political pushback. And we think there's at least 6 reasons that explain this in part. One is a recent and generalized experience of immigration. Almost every country has an experience of emigration and has diasporas abroad. Many countries, in fact, have immigration laws that are fairly generous to immigrants, in part because at a time of low migration within the hemisphere, they were trying to model the kind of policies they wanted the US and Canada and Europe to adopt. And so that's a result really of having this experience with immigration and being much more focused on immigration than immigration. Secondly, there is a symbolic construction of common regions of shared history, culture, and identity. We see this in the Caribbean with the attempt to create a region mobility. We see this in Mercosur, in the Andean region, South America in general, to some extent in Central America. There is this sense of a common arena. Now, as I always say, I mean, there is always a risk when you rely on solidarity. Solidarity means that they're in groups and out groups, right? And so, South America has been relatively responsive to Venezuelan displacement, but comparatively less so to Haitian displacement, although in the end has provided legal status to most Haitians in Brazil and Chile, but much less welcoming than to Venezuelans. And the flip is true in Trinidad, actually, where there's more welcome to Haitians than there is to Venezuelans. Symbolic construction of common identities is both inclusive and exclusive, but it's been useful in some cases. Third, really perceived inequalities promotes concerns of competition. We think that's a factor. Actually, it's made it hard for integration to happen, and creates a lot of the frustration that you see that has yet to be fully politicized, but could become politicized. I mean, it is a factor that affects policy decision making, and concerns that particularly as migrants come in, they often move into the informal markets and actually may in fact compete with others in the informal market of native born. Changes in crime and insecurity. We actually have done some work looking at the crime rates of immigrants, Venezuelans in particular, and then immigrants more broadly in several countries. Turns out they like in the US, but unlike in Europe, like in the US and Canada, unlike in parts of Europe, immigrants appear to be less likely to commit crimes, less likely to have be a proportion. There are a lower proportion of those arrested, convicted, and imprisoned than the native born, than their proportion of the population. That said, much of the recent rise in migration has happened at the same time that crime rates have gone up in several countries. And so it is not surprising that in some countries, in Chile and Ecuador in particular, there's been a strong sense that the migrants bought the crime because the two phenomena happened at the same time, even though it doesn't appear to be true in fact. Geopolitical pressures are also important in shaping policies, and this cuts many ways. In the case of Mexico and Central America, geopolitical pressures have been particularly important in more restrictive measures and particularly trying to keep people from moving onwards to the United States. In South America, actually international pressure, to and international support to provide legal status, for example, or support for displaced populations has been very important in some of the more open policies. And finally, capacity restraints are both a source of creativity and a limit on policy implementation. And that may sound unusual, but in fact, one of the realities is the lack of institutionality, the lack of thinking about immigration, because immigration was not a big issue before 2010 or in many countries before 2016 or 2017, meant that executive branches had enormous leeway in making decisions about migration policy, could often be quite creative. They can often decide to create a legal status that didn't exist without even going to the legislature. On the other hand, it has real constraints in terms of policy implementation and follow through. And so lots of things that exist on paper take a long time or may never actually happen in practice. I mean, for example, getting irregular migrants into the education system may be allowed, but in fact, the process of making it happen may take a very long time and not completely happen everywhere. Migration is at a turning point. We're seeing a decline in irregular migration, but this will end. US deportation plans are reshaping bilateral negotiations and sidelining integration efforts. There's been a huge turn in many countries towards having to think about how they will integrate those who are deported. And many countries have been negotiating agreements to receive third country migrants. We've seen this in Mexico, Guatemala. Mexico already did it previously. Guatemala, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica. Absent lawful migration pathways, migrants are testing new strategies in a fragmented policy landscape. There is some movement onto Brazil from people in South America. Cubans seem to be going to South America and Mexico in large numbers. We're seeing some mobility in the region. We're seeing more Venezuelans and Colombians headed to Spain. So there's a change in pathway, and some people are waiting to see if things change at the US border. And finally, asylum and protection pathways are uncertain as governments reconsider requirements and procedures. Some of the temporary 10-year status for Venezuelans in Colombia, for example, or Ecuador has recently suspended the legalization program they were doing for not just Venezuelans, for various nationalities when US aid cuts kicked in. So there's some real uncertainty on legal status going forward in some countries. And I think with that, Ariel, we'll turn to comments, actually, to Rubén's comments, and then to everyone else.
Yes, thank you so much to the authors. And now we're going to invite Rubén Hernández-León, director of the Latin American Institute and professor of sociology at UCLA. Before we go to that, I just want to point your direction to the chat. I put information about the book and about the recording that is going to be available at our center's websites. So with that, Rubén, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Ariel and Andrew, for your presentation. I have to say from the get-go that this is both the presentation and the book so comprehensive that you almost stole my thunder here, because you already addressed some of the questions that I had. I'm still going to post them, and I'm still going to just offer for those who came in late, my own very quick distillation of the main points of the book. So the book makes, of course, the point that Latin America and the Caribbean have seen unprecedented numbers of migrants, particularly after 2010, because of several displacement crises. Another important point that was, is the part of the structure of the book and the presentation today, is that there are three migratory systems in the region, each with its own dynamics and logic: South America, Mexico and Central America, and the Caribbean, right? Each one constitutes its own system of sorts, but there are, important overlaps. And some of those overlaps were, of course, addressed today as they are addressed in the book. Much of the unprecedented movement of the last 15 years is due to the collapse of the Venezuelan economy. And that collapse, of course, produced basically the conditions for the movement of more than 7 million migrants, 7.5, depending on how you count. But most of them actually have gone to South American countries, as is detailed in the book. South American countries have, dealt with the aftermath of admitting and working on a variety of policies of integration for, again, the great majority of these migrants. And of course, as we know, the second most important source of migration numerically in this period has been Haiti, which has seen, constant political turmoil, a sort of collapse of its economy, as well as sort of the general state after the earthquake, and also sort of generalized violence. Another important, I would say, even central point of the book, and that has been restated here, is that given the difficulty of dealing with large numbers of migrants very, very suddenly, very quickly, Latin American and Caribbean governments have, in general, sort of met the challenge, particularly with regards to providing paths for legal temporary presence to migrants. The notable exception, of course, is the Dominican Republic, with its policy towards Haitians in particular, not towards Venezuelans. But this point partly addresses a question that Ariel raised in his turn at the bat, and that question was: is there a Latin American system or migration management system? I'm not sure there is a single one, but I think that in general, the Latin American and Caribbean experience, with some of these exceptions, has been less punitive, although this is also the subject of or could be the subject of substantial debate. Certainly in South America, there's been less of that sort of punitive stance towards or response towards immigrants. And another important point here is that despite the sort of initial mostly responsive, mostly positive responses on the part of Latin American and Caribbean governments, there are lingering questions about the capacity not just to admit people legally, but also to develop, sort of serious or more consistent integration paths for these, populations on the move. It's always a question in migration studies, right? How many of those, or what proportion of those who are on the move will stay under what conditions, and whether responses by the receiving country or changing conditions or the opening of other opportunities will actually change the direction of movement, will change people's minds, alter strategies, and so forth and so on. I think that also the book takes a general sort of positive conclusion and outlook on the fact that there's a lot of institutional learning, initial capacity building, and a lot of country-to-country cooperation, regional agreements, as Andrew outlined in the part of the presentation. So this is, again, for those who came in sort of late to the presentation, that's kind of my own distillation. I think that there, in response once again to Ariel's question, there's probably not a Latin American and Caribbean migration management system. It's clearly, different sub-regional realities that are, respond to history and to, different geopolitical circumstances. In some respects, the fact that South America has been able to sort of craft its own response to the Venezuelan crisis has to do with its own migration of history, but it also has to do with the fact that it's, far away from the United States in general, and that South American countries have more, or have had more autonomy dealing with the Venezuelan crisis. Of course, a lot of that migration has gone to neighboring Colombia, but it's not the same reality that Mexico and Central American countries face, precisely because of the role of the United States. I have to say that I was surprised not to see more attention or not more sort of space and discussion dedicated to the Cuban case, and perhaps this is something that the authors can address in the Q&A section. And I think that since the word policies is in the title or subtitle of the book, I think that we can have a little bit more of a discussion about, although Andrew was getting into that in the part of the presentation, in the sense that, to what extent are these, policies actually being sort of implemented on the ground? To what extent are institutional narratives more than realities? To what extent, depending on the part of the subcontinent we're looking at, these policies meet more or less resistance from migrants, to what extent these policies, or to what extent migrants adapt to these policies, depending on the options and opportunities. The authors emphasize the fact that there is still a lot of institutional capacity lacking, and that means many things. One, that once again, these policies remain mostly narratives, but also that states have to rely on third parties to learn to implement with all the potential shortcomings and drawbacks that that represents. And finally, I want to touch on something that Andrew mentioned, and that is, the fact that we have not seen, by and large, a sort of a negative response on the part of civil society towards the various Latin American civil societies towards these migration or migrations, depending on where we're looking at. And that, I think, has to do, as Andrew said, with the fact that historically these Latin American governments have had a kind of sort of embargo on the whole sort of migration issue, right? In other words, they have, ably, I would say, maneuvered to keep migration as a kind of domain of the elites, including political elites. And so, but we have seen already glimpses of what happens when migration, when migration is not contained, at least in the sense that I'm referring to, right? That is, it spills over to impacting interest of various social groups in Latin America. I distinctly remember, excuse me, the negative response of border or Mexican border communities and Mexican border organizations when or during the Central American caravans, because they saw those caravans as a threat to a kind of special relations that Mexican border communities have with the U.S. and with the U.S. market, or access to the U.S. market, right? These caravans, of course, produce a very sort of loud and negative response on the part of Donald Trump during his first presidency, including the very vociferously stated threat of closing the border between that, and that, of course, produced a very negative response on some Mexicans, at least, towards these caravans and so on. So a version of this has happened in Chile, as Andrew mentioned, and other parts of Latin America. So I think that this is something that we can return to in the discussion. And I think that I'm going to yield the floor so we can actually go to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Rubén, for your comments. And I'm going to give a couple of minutes, 2, 3, 5 minutes most, to the authors to respond to any of your points. And then we can move on to the Q&A, as we already have a couple of comments on the chat, but anyone can raise their hands for with a question. But before that, the authors.
You
So
want to go
thank
first?
you. Yeah, I'll go first. Thank you, Rubén, for your comments. I think they're spot on in the key things that we talk about, but you're right to point to the Cuban case that we didn't really emphasize as much. And I think part of the reason is because, well, there's two reasons. One of them, I think, Cuban migration, and in one of the key things that we try to focus on the book is how Cuban migration has actually happened in Latin America. But you're right to point out that because of the long history of Cuban migration toward the United States, and then relatively speaking, diplomatic relations with other countries in Latin America, it's something that we could have gone more into detail about, especially with the more recently, and by recently I mean since 2016 forward, the focus, but also the level of engagement that caused in Mexico, for example, when there were people from Cuban background trying to move to come to the United States. I think it's taken different changes and evolved, and that's something that definitely we could have made a stronger case. Though I do think in parts and pieces of what we put into those graphs and the stories that we tell, The Cuban perspective is also different because in some cases similar to Venezuelans, where there was a relatively higher educated population that then became a not as highly educated population, lower income, and the different dynamics that it's had. I think that Cubans have been, for the most part, Cuban migrants have been able in some ways to adapt better than other nationalities to the different changes in the system that we've seen in the United States and in the region, especially in Mexico. Other than that, I think you mentioned the key points. Andrew, I don't know if you want to have something else before we jump over to the discussions. I think then, seeing that Andrew doesn't have anything, one of the key pieces I also appreciated you bringing up, Rubén, was the focus on the caravans. We don't really get into it as well, but the focus of the caravans, especially not just the optics, which is clearly what President Trump in his first term was focusing on, but also the origins and the organization of it, meant not just a change in routes, but a change in how immigrants themselves have agency to be able to come together and move in ways that hadn't happened in the past. Obviously, there's been allegations that they were orchestrated by other actors and things of that nature. But when we go back to 2018, which I see as sort of the turning point for caravans, Honduras in particularly, and the 3 caravans that organized then, under this sort of self objective to try to seek protection by traveling together, especially as a direct protest to then the administration of Juan Orlando Hernández, was a significant turning point for how people use their agency and mobilized across the region. We've seen that end or dissipate from the main attention in the news. Caravans have happened for decades. They are still happening. They're just smaller numbers and therefore out of our context. But I think that's another great point, Rubén. Thank you for making that.
Great. By the way, I see, we're looking for the discount code. There is a discount code for the book, by the way, so we'll see if we can track it down. But Rubén, thank you very much for the comments. Cecilia, thank you very much for hosting this and the introduction. Let's go to the questions. I mean, I guess the one thing I would say, and Rubén, I do think there is, except with the exception that the big difference, I think, in Latin America and the Caribbean, if we were to choose one that's different than the United States and Europe, and I just came out of a meeting with mostly Europeans governments for the last 2 days and former government officials, identity politics is at the center of many things. It's not the only thing. I mean, there's worries about jobs. There's fears about, loss of integrity of immigration systems because borders aren't controlled, and sometimes visa categories haven't been patrolled well. And, so, I mean, all those things are there. But identity is clearly one of the things driving debate in the United States and in Europe, right? That's true in the Dominican Republic with Haiti, right? I mean, the definition of being Dominican is not being Haitian and vice versa. There's a lot of history there, and race plays a role. And, there's all sorts of, far be it for me to be an expert on Dominican Republic, but let's just say that's, identity is clearly there. I think it plays a bit of a role in Chile as well, by the way. I think it's probably not an accident that we're seeing a bit of a pushback because Chile, frankly, has very educated Venezuelan. Venezuelans have become the most educated of the Venezuelans who made it in the major countries. Actually, just took a lot of resources to get to Chile. So, but there's it is where we're seeing it becoming somewhat politicized, not to the same level as Dominican Republic. We haven't seen that happen in the same way elsewhere. Maybe with Haitians and other parts of the Caribbean, but it's also there to some extent. But I think it's more complicated. I would never, however, discount that can't happen. Right? I mean, we can build identity politics out of anything. Right? We can identify. I mean, I've heard Colombians tell me how much Venezuelans are their sisters and brothers, and we're one people, and we have all the same music. And I've heard Colombians tell me that Venezuelans have terrible taste in music, and they're not like us at all. And I mean, it is you've heard variations of this in the U.S. and Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland, we can find differences in anything. So, but it hasn't happened yet, right? I mean, the identity politics has been less part of the debate, which has made it less toxic. Now, I think some of the resource constraints really matter, right? And I think things can blow up on that really easily. The fact that, kids are in overcrowded schools, if you're a parent, and a bunch of, people from another country show up and suddenly there are more kids in your child's class, those things, housing, those basic things, I think, are in some ways much more brittle in parts of Latin America and the Caribbean because people are living closer to, day-to-day existence. But the identity side has not taken off yet in the same way. And I keep saying yet because I think we should never discount it as a possibility. But I think that is the saving grace that differentiates the experience so far from what we're seeing in Europe and the US. But let's answer the great questions and comments here, actually.
You have
Cecilia, how do
questions
you want us to
in
do
the
this?
chat.
Yes.
Do you want me to read the questions so that everybody, and anyone can please raise your hand if you have other questions. You can use the chat or the raise hand.
I've lost the questions. I had them here a
So
second ago.
one
So do you want to?
Yeah, one question is, what would you say is a common misconception about Latin America plus and the Caribbean regarding immigration and the economy or crime? That's one question. I'm going to read both to see which one you want to take first. With the dismantling of USAID and other migration priorities of the US government, does your analysis / research identify another world / global power stepping in to fill in that gap to influence migration patterns in Latin America and Caribbean as part of their own foreign policy agenda? So two questions, different ones.
So in some ways, our timing of this book was great, and in some ways it was absolutely terrible, right? Which is to say, we captured an era particularly well, that had not been captured there's some really good writing about this in particular countries, but we were trying to do a regional view, which hadn't been done, and it's very useful. But the book ends when Trump gets elected, right? And so literally we got, I think, a page and a half that we were able to add at the end to talk about everything, which we're thankful to the publisher actually that allowed us to do that, to add a page and a half to say something. But this is other than saying everything has changed, it's hard to say much in a page and a half. So but at the same time, some of what we talk about has changed dramatically, right? And so I think one of the things, I don't think we discount how much international cooperation mattered to some of the policies, particularly in South America, of reception, integration of migrants, particularly Venezuelans, also Nicaraguans and Costa Rica. Mexico's asylum system, 2/3 of it was being paid by UNHCR, largely through US funds, and so there's a lot of the things that were part of the infrastructure of policy decisions that were financed by the international community. No one else is stepping in. I mean, the Europeans have been cutting their development aid back somewhat as well for their own internal reasons, not as drastic as the US, but there's no one stepping into the gap. And there's no country, Canada and Spain are very interested in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they don't have the same level of interest and the same, the same presence and the same history in the region, particularly in development. And Spain is divided between Africa and Latin America. I mean, they very much look both directions, right? Canada very much looks to Asia Pacific as much as to the Americas. So the US was really the one power that looked, mostly towards the region. And Ariel hinted at this too early, but there's also the changes in policy in Washington also influence the policy environment in countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. To some extent, what you're seeing, I mean, the same in Europe, same elsewhere, by the way. I mean, it's very interesting hearing Europeans governments saying, we don't want to be like the US, including some of the governments you would see as being much tougher in Europe. Actually, were very interesting in the meetings we were in the last couple of days and saying, yeah, but we're not going to do what Donald Trump's doing. I mean, it was very, very, they want to mark, even though they want to get tougher on migration, they don't want to be seen as going that far. But I do think it does create a permissive environment for countries to, be much less generous, and they're not getting the same sort of credit or resources for trying to bet on policies of integration. So Ariel, do you want to dive on do you want to jump into the other
Yeah,
question?
so the common misconceptions, I think the one example that comes to mind is there's been a lot of misconceptions about how immigrants often take more, and we usually see this in the United States, take more benefits than they contribute, and that they are not always as able to integrate into the economies And I think there's a few examples, but one that I'll mention to you that defies that misconception is Haitian immigrants in Mexico. Haitian immigrants in Mexico, despite almost significant barriers, racial, class, language barriers, have been able to adapt and become, for the most part, become able to adapt and create their own smaller economies and facilitate migration assistance, even among other groups that were coming to Mexico in the last several years. Haitians in Tijuana, Haitians in Tapachula, we've seen that those communities have been important aspects of doing that. And in fact, in some cases, they have actually led to increasing services and providing more contributions in these local economies. Of course, there's still prevalent issues of discrimination in many places in Mexico when it comes to racial issues, but that's one of the key pieces that, even when there is difficulties for integration in general or economic independence or formality, labor markets that incentivize in formal jobs and economic opportunities, there are still opportunities that migrants make for themselves and then usually share with each other. And I think Haitians is one of the key components in Mexico. So that's the one I would add for that.
We go to the next question
So-
in the chat,
Oh,
or
yeah,
to
go ahead.
add something to
Let me just
that,
add to that. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, in our research, we found that the crime rates for migrants were generally less than for the native-born populations.
Right.
This is the proportion of just judged by proportion of arrests and convictions and prison sentences. Now, our data is about 3 years old, so things could have changed, but we don't think so. And some of this, there's other people in Chile and Ecuador that have updated some of this data, so we think it holds true. There are some exceptions. There's actually some in the border areas of Colombia and Venezuela. Colombia, I mean, there is a higher crime rate by Venezuelans, but we think a lot of that is contraband and it's historical rather than migrants. Nicaraguans in Costa Rica seem to have similar conviction rates to Costa Rica. And so there's a couple exceptions, but generally crime, it generally, and again, there is no universal law that migrants commit less or more crime than the native born, right? It is really contextual, but it does seem that there's a Western Hemisphere pattern where migrants seem to be less likely to commit crime than the native born. And it is probably explained, which is not necessarily true in Europe. But I suspect some of this is because there isn't a lot of social support, and people who come in have to go to work. I mean, people are actually, if you're going to stick around, you're entering the labor market, and it is it's probably the profile of people who are coming, whatever, but it does seem to hold across most of at least the cases we've seen, from Canada and Argentina, it does seem to Chile, it does seem to hold overall. The other is, by the way, this is an article I wrote early on in the Venezuelan displacement was called "Will Venezuela's Loss Be Latin America's Gain?" And I think actually that's been true. I do think there was some displacement in informal markets. There's a series of 3 studies commissioned by the IDB that looked at this, that all find in Brazil, I think it's Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, that there was some loss of wages, loss of income for informal sector workers in the first 2 years of the Venezuelan displacement, like the two big years. And after that, it evened out, right? Everything was fine. But this shouldn't surprise us completely, because so many of the Venezuelans, you didn't have a natural distribution of people coming into different kinds of jobs. Almost everyone is coming into informal markets. They're trying to sell things on the street. It's kind of what you do when you're leaving in a very precarious situation. And so there were, I think we should assume that folks aren't crazy when they say, yeah, it was really hard. I couldn't compete. And, that probably some of that actually happened. By the way, US studies don't always hold up on that, but the US is a different labor market, right? So I think we should assume the fact that there's so much in the informal market in Latin America may mean that there's just different realities. In the long term, what you're seeing is actually some really good human capital. I mean, on average, migrant populations are pretty educated, actually. I mean, there is sort of a positive selection of people that have been able to leave countries like Nicaragua and Haiti and Venezuela. And countries have actually done pretty well, and it's probably expanding GDP. There are also a few studies on this done by the World Bank and the IMF and the IDB that actually suggests that there's a couple percentage, 0.2%, 2.3% gain annual gain in GDP per year as a result of migration. So, I mean, that's, probably the long-term positive, but we shouldn't ignore that there may have been some short-term negatives too.
So there's another question. Do you consider the, in quote, voluntary and or, quote, forced return migration given persecution/expulsion of alleged illegal immigration status or the actual increase of the cost of living, in parentheses, as a result of the vagaries of tariffs and the overall US economy? It would be interesting to hear a bit about that.
Ariel?
We talk about deportations and returns in especially the chapter on Mexico and Central America, because that's usually what we've seen the most returns to. When we look at the South America piece, we did document that there was beginning to be some return migration, especially Venezuelans from Central America primarily, but also some in Mexico to try to go back to Colombia. In some instances, also to Venezuela. But that was mostly in terms of expectations of policies around the US and context that was getting more difficult across the board. We didn't say this enough, but I think it's important to note that it's not just the US that has adopted more strict guidelines about control management. Mexico is probably among the top in the hemisphere that has adopted significant controls as well, that have pushed people back, made it more difficult for people to live or to transit the country, and therefore more of them have been directly deported or have been incentivized to return on their own because of lack of abilities and opportunities. So that's the way we get into it, but that doesn't really get into the size and the scale that we have now. Again, the book was written or finished right before President Trump came into office. And so therefore we don't capture the nuances that now take place and could actually lead to a significant level of increase. And looking ahead, many of the countries that saw immigration decrease now could, for example, Mexico, may now have to refocus its efforts, as they say they are doing, to try to increase the better reception and reintegration of the people that have left behind or that are leaving, and not even to focus the people that are being left behind of different statuses. I think that gets more complicated in South America because Colombia and Chile and others, where they have had Venezuelans who have settled for at least at least a few years or more, have already or had different mixed status families of people. We've recognized and seen, in fact, that Chileans, that Venezuelans who had come to, or Haitians and specifically, had come through or to the United States at the Mexico-US border, many of them were in Mexico, had also been detained and had people who were actually born in other countries to Venezuelan parents. So Chilean children, Haitian parents, Venezuelans with other migrants from other nationalities. I think that is something that we didn't get to capture here as well. So I think the scale could increase, but certainly from what we were able to figure out, and that point that we looked at the factors and capacity is an important one. And what is the capacity for countries themselves to receive their own nationals back? And now the important new wrinkle in this is that more countries, by US pressure and other reasons, and for the reasons, are accepting third country national migrants back. And that's not something that we get into the book as much, even though it started happening under the Biden administration for Mexico, for example. Andrew, would you add something to that?
This is Professor Hunnefeld's question. I as we were writing the book, I had, Christine in the back of my brain saying, you need to actually think in terms of the different groups of people that are involved here. Can you dig down? We actually we started off with, if you we'll go back to our early writings, we were trying to figure out, we were to look at integration by race, by gender, by income, by education. One of the things we realized really early on is that the data is not that good. And there's no way we could build a data. I mean, with the existing, there's no way we could build a data set for the whole region. But just the studies there aren't that good, actually. I mean, I've been looking for a good study on race and ethnicity and migration for a class that I teach, and there just isn't one yet that I found. If anyone knows of one, please let me know, by the way. But I haven't found one. Some of this, the migration field within Latin America, not migration to the U.S., Europe, field within of people within Latin America and the Caribbean is still fairly new, right? Because this was a secondary phenomenon to people leaving the region, right? I mean, there's certainly a lot of good historical research, right, from previous migrations to the region. But, there was, a couple dozen scholars who had been mining this field for many years. But it is not it does not have the depth of research and the, and the data sets and everything that research on immigration in the United States does. And so a lot of the questions on integration that we thought we could answer at the beginning, we really couldn't, because we couldn't dig down to that much more specific level that recognizes the very different patterns of incorporation in the countries that they go to, and part of that is conditioned by gender, race, ethnicity, language, initial level of education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I see Christine has her hand up.
Yes,
so.
Christine.
Professor.
Yeah, I can.
I still call her professor, so.
I'm sorry. You can call me Christine from now on, because
I know that.
I continue admiring your work, and yours too, Ariel. It's a great job that you did. But I see a next book coming out, because the questions that you are asking right now are important, no? So we need
They're
to
really
know
important.
a bit more, because what also comes in here is the whole divide of the families, no? And Trump's attempt to take away the nationality of people born in the United States, but the parents are illegal immigrants. So separation of family and all these conflicts, no, that are more on the ground. Well, in any case, I will look forward to the 20% discount of your book and buy it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Christine. Great to hear you.
Any other questions? And with respect to research on race, ethnicity, and I think language you mentioned, race, ethnicity, and migration in Latin America in general?
Yeah, within Latin America, yeah.
Yes, there is actually research on that, but it's qualitative. It doesn't have it's not based on the large data sets. It's an ethnographic, it's qualitative. It's
Yeah.
still very, very, very much research and very much follows protocols of research, but it's not, it's hard to get the large data sets that the US, of course, has. There's
also because race and ethnicity are not classified in the same way.
Absolutely. I was going to say that too.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to make those comparisons. But even aside from the comparisons, it's difficult to get a sense for a generalized idea and generalizable idea about these connections. Although there is more in-depth work based on qualitative interviews and that kind of thing, but not the large data sets that we're used to in the US. Christine, again?
Yeah, let me add just one more point, because I think the rhythm of criminalization of migration is very different, even from state to state in this country, no? And certainly you mentioned it a couple of times when it comes to other South American countries or even to Europe, no? Particularly in Spain. So the rhythm of criminalization is very different, no? And this is something.
It's very different. I mean, you mean in the sense that it has not been as strong in Latin America, or in what sense, Christine?
Yeah, not as strong, and not in the definition of what illegal immigration is. No? I mean, in Germany, for instance, it goes all the way from Angela Merkel to today's president. No, you have a different cycle. No, what is good and what is bad in terms of very concrete interests in each country. No?
I mean, I think that's true. I think that is one of the bigger dangers, though, I think is that there are some voices now in Latin America and the Caribbean who have started to refer to the migrants as the cause of crime. You don't get them referring to all migrants as criminals, right? But in some of this, in the case of Chile, I mean, I think the identity issue is there, but I think also the other thing in Chile that happened, and we do talk about this in the book, is that the Tren de Aragua, the Venezuelan, criminal group, which by the way is not that present in the U.S., contrary to what you may hear from the White House. I mean, it has a ephemeral presence in the U.S., but it's fairly disorganized in the U.S., is actually quite organized in Chile. And the history is that the trade that actually was doing some of the smuggling, long distance smuggling to Chile to get family members in, they got into extorting Venezuelan business owners. And then they sort of started taking over parts of the Chilean, fairly weak Chilean organized crime networks. And so it is, two things are true at the same time, which is, Venezuelans are much less likely on average to commit crimes. And the most horrific crimes have been committed by Venezuelans. But they're different populations, right? I mean, you have Tren de Aragua, which is involved in organized crime, which came to prey on Venezuelans, right? I mean, you facilitate Venezuela and then prey on them, and got it. But so what Chileans see is high impact crimes, in a country that didn't have a lot of high impact crimes, have been disproportionately Venezuelan. But your average Venezuelan is actually much less likely to commit a crime than your average Chilean. So, but that certainly shapes the narrative, right? And that begins then to make, it doesn't take far for people to start saying, oh, it's the Venezuelans that caused this.
Right. Excuse me, even before that, in Mexico, in media studies, people have talked about a narrative in Mexican media, criminalizing Central American migrants for a long, long time. And so there is that narrative of criminalization of certain groups, and not all Central Americans either, only those who cross by land. And so there's also a social class angle there, in addition to race and ethnicity. Rubén?
In relation to what you said, Cecilia, and the reference to qualitative studies, and what Ariel mentioned also about Haitians, there are some studies also that actually show how in Tijuana, for example, Haitians and their very sort of entrepreneurial drive, right, creating a variety of businesses, restaurants, et cetera, was used actually to stigmatize Central Americans, casting Haitians as the good migrant, right, as the sort of model minority. These were the good migrants and the ones that were showing sort of gratitude to Mexican society and so forth and so on, whereas Central Americans were the bad migrants because they were actually complaining because they were not appreciative enough of what Mexico and Mexicans were doing for them. So there's a little bit of that happening on the ground under the sort of surface, and it does take qualitative studies actually to get at that stuff. I mean, in relation to the longer question of integration, of course, and the issue of sort of large scale data, I mean, part of the issue I think is that this is too recent to as a phenomenon, and it's not these sort of large scale census data or surveys may not capture small populations to begin with well enough, and also again it's sort of recent, right? I do think that there might be also something, or this is something that we could just speculating about, that this might be in some cases this might also reflect state policies, meaning that to the extent that migrants are contained in certain parts of a country, to the extent that migrants have not access to particular services, of course, and they're not going to show up, right, in these sort of metrics of integration. You're not going to see them, I mean, one of the interesting things about Central Americans in Mexico is that, a huge percentage of them, a huge proportion, remains in Chiapas, right? They are in the state of Chiapas, and I think that reflects, of course, proximity to Central America, there's an interest in keeping relations to or with families and communities in the various Central American countries. But it also reflects a policy of the Mexican state that historically has been sort of intent on keeping this migration contained. So I think that this is also the data in that sense is not neutral, right? I mean, it'll reflect a variety of policies.
Yeah, no, very much so. And yeah, Ariel and I spent some time in Tijuana together. I used to live in Tijuana for almost 6 years, so in my younger days. So it's a city I go back to a lot. And Ariel and I spent some time together there a couple of years ago, and the dynamics between Haitians and Central Americans are fascinating. I mean, that Haitians are both stigmatized sometimes, right? There appears to be, I mean, again, we don't know this for sure, but there appears to be a higher rate of police harassment, for example, at least what you hear from activists and people in the Haitian community against Haitians. But at the same time, they really are held up as sort of the model immigrant, right? As the successful immigrant. I remember years ago, a shelter director, when the first group arrived of Haitians, telling me he used to get calls, asking for Haitian workers. And he said, I don't have any Haitian, because all the Haitians had now, by then, had moved into the community and were working. He said, I don't have any Haitians, but I have lots of Salvadorans and Guatemalans, and, take your pick. And they're like, no, we want Haitians. I mean, there is really this sort of, and it varies from country to country, right? I mean, who are and sometimes region to region, right? I mean, in different countries, and one thing we didn't say is most countries actually have pretty diverse migrant communities. I mean, Colombia and Peru are unique in having mostly Venezuelans, right? Dominican Republic was unique in having mostly Haitians, although they do have Venezuelans and a few others, actually, Americans, a few others. But most countries have a variety of people, right? I mean, it isn't sort of one national, and Costa Rica with Nicaraguans, but actually Costa Rica's got, they got a lot of Colombians and Venezuelans, and Americans are the fourth group also. Like almost every country actually has this mix, right? And sometimes it's sort of geographically distributed. And so the way people perceive different migrant groups is sometimes different. I mean, sometimes they think of migrants, but sometimes they think of specific groups, and how they may think of them can be contextual also, right? Depending where you are in the country, and who is seen as the criminal migrant, or who's seen as the hard worker, or who's seen as the high skilled migrant. I mean, it's somewhat variable. So.
And even within Central American countries, there is quite a bit of labor migration between Honduras and El Salvador, Nicaraguans to El Salvador, because El Salvador pays in dollars. So that is attractive to other workers in the region. And there are, of course, different attitudes and perspectives about people who are Central Americans too, and that develop about criminality but that's, those are smaller, of course, much smaller flaws, but it happens. There's quite a bit of movement and similar perspectives and attitudes develop there as well. Well, I think we are at the end. This has been a very interesting, rich conversation. We still have 28 people on the call, so that's quite nice. Information about the book and with a discount code. It's on the chat, and this presentation has been recorded and it's going to be available on our website. So thank you so much to the authors, to the discussant, congratulations on this great book, and to all the people who participated on the call for all your questions. This has been extremely rich and informative. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Muchas gracias, muito obrigado. Thank you guys, everyone. Merci. Yes. Take care. Thank you, Cecilia, for hosting us.
All the applause is coming in.